Bishop, good morning.
Good morning, Reverend.
Good morning, panel.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming and attending the Rainbow Push Coalition and Citizenship Education Fund's annual Media and Telecommunications Symposium. This year, we're challenged to do things a bit differently, doing it online this year in the wake of our pandemic. We want to thank all of our sponsors for supporting this particular event: Verizon Communications, Charter Communications, T-Mobile, Comcast Communications, and the Motion Picture Association of America. Our theme this year for this symposium is charting a path forward for digital education and economic inclusion. We began our discussion on yesterday with session 1 on education and the implications for the educational achievement Black students led by Dr. Nicole. And today, our session 2, what COVID-19 has taught us about digital equity or the lack thereof. Our moderator today is Dominic Harrison from the Aspen Institute. Before we go into our panel discussion today, we want to introduce to you our keynote speaker, none other than Starks. He's going to give us opening remarks, and then we're going to go into our discussion a little later on. I'll give you instructions after we hear from Dr. Jeffrey Starks. We're turning it over to him.
Thank you to Reverend Jesse Jackson for inviting me to speak today at the Media and Telecommunications Symposium. And thank you to the Rainbow Push Coalition and the Citizenship Education Fund for your continued advocacy for civil rights on behalf of our most marginalized communities. In this prominent year in the fight for racial and economic justice, it is imperative that we recognize that this movement would not have been possible without the tireless efforts or the work of our historic civil rights organizations like yours that have reminded us that the fight for justice is neither a fleeting moment nor a state of convenience. It is instead a consistent, ever-evolving movement built on the personal and professional sacrifices made by civil rights leaders and others who advocate for those who have been ignored or forgotten. In 2020, this movement requires us to fight diligently for innovative policies in the technology and telecom sector that centers on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, immigrant, LGBTQ+, and low-income communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that the stakes have never been higher. Our failure to create inclusive policies that close the digital divide has done serious harm to the Americans who are already struggling to put food on their tables prior to the pandemic. The failures of our past, however, do not have to dictate our future. It is time, it is in fact past time, for the tech and telecom sector to take account of issues dealing with equity and fairness. These are not far off distant concepts. These are principles that will anchor our shared collective future. One of the last trips that I took before the novel coronavirus began raging through the country was a southern tour throughout the southeastern United States. I made many stops, but none meant more to me than my opportunity to visit Selma, Alabama. As I entered that historic town, I crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the site, of course, of Bloody Sunday, where the late Congressman John Lewis risked his life and many others in the fight for civil rights. I was reminded of how much work still needs to be done to live up to the idea of freedom that our ancestors dreamed of. After all, it was Congressman Lewis who once said, and I quote, "Access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century," close quote. I was proud to amplify the congressman's legacy recently in an op-ed in Essence, alongside civil rights leaders, where we called attention to the need for broadband to empower communities of color across our nation. We have seen this digital divide morph into a monstrous COVID-19 divide. Many of the advocates present here today have been discussing the effects of the digital divide for decades, and so I know you all can relate to both the exasperation and frustration I felt when this global pandemic finally laid bare that access to broadband, The devices needed to have full online experience, and the skills needed to safely navigate the internet are essential to our lives. And it also took this moment for us to more properly expand the narrative of who remains on the wrong side of the digital divide. It is not just those in rural areas who lack access to broadband. In fact, 3 times as many households in urban areas remain unconnected as in rural areas. What's more is that a disproportionate number of people of color do not have a home broadband connection compared to their white counterparts. So here's what that means. First, the digital divide and the economic opportunity divide run parallel to one another. Broadband is the vehicle that allows individuals to take control of their lives, empower themselves, their households, their communities. Whether families are piling into their minivans to sit in parking lots in Mississippi or New York, we are negatively impacting the personal dignity of these Americans. Working family members should be able to set up their workstations from the safety of their actual homes instead of setting up a schedule and a map of locations to access free Wi-Fi. And it is important to acknowledge that those who are currently out of work due to this unprecedented public health crisis are disproportionately from communities of color. The recent Economic Policy Institute report shows that the unemployment rate for black workers is higher than the peak of the overall unemployment rate during the Great Recession. This is an emergency. Broadband is important for these Americans to be able to file for unemployment claims online right now. But even more important is for our future, where these workers will absolutely need home broadband to apply for jobs, access to job training, or work remotely once the economy turns around. We should also be aware of how this moment impacts black-owned businesses that are on the wrong side of the technology divide. This pandemic has caused approximately 440,000 black-owned businesses to shutter. That's a 41% plunge since the beginning of February. Research shows that many black-owned businesses do not have the same resources to digitize their companies and respond to the moment so that consumers can access their services and products online. Black-owned businesses are the cornerstone of our neighborhoods, and they need access to updated technology so that they can continue to serve our communities. And rebooting our economy means ensuring that black businesses get connected. Second, there's no greater reminder of our intersecting fates during this pandemic than that of our dependency on essential workers, who are overwhelmingly Black and Latinx. Less than 1 in 5 Black workers and roughly 1 in 6 Latinx workers can work from home, which means their work outside of the home puts them at greater risk for exposure to the virus. Black, Indigenous, Latinx Americans all have a death rate higher due to COVID-19 at nearly triple or more than their white counterparts. Access to telehealth services via affordable, reliable broadband can save lives during this pandemic. It will allow people to safely manage their health from home without an in-person visit to an emergency room or physician's office. Telehealth services will become increasingly important for workers who are unable to take time off to travel to a doctor's appointment. If we invest in broadband, we will lessen the health disparities across our most marginalized communities. Third, during this time of increased social distancing, broadband access allows us to keep in touch with our loved ones, and that helps our mental health. This is incredibly important to our seniors who are at the highest risk of falling victim to the virus. The period of time can be extremely isolating for this age group in particular, whether they're quarantining in their own homes or in assisted living facilities. Our seniors are some of the most disconnected. During these crucial times where fellowship with church members and hugs from grandkids can be virtual, they need access to affordable broadband, especially because many of our elders are on fixed incomes. Additionally, this is the group that needs a helping hand with digital skills so that they can send those pictures of that secret mac and cheese this coming Thanksgiving. We must prioritize the needs of the generations that have given us so much. Fourth, and finally, we must prioritize our youngest learners, our future leaders. As a father of a kindergartner myself, I know that working and teaching from home has been extremely difficult for parents to manage. But I always remind myself that my hardships pale in comparison to those parents who do not have or cannot afford broadband access at home for their students to keep up with their studies. Research shows that Black students may fall 10.3 months behind, and Latinx students are at a risk of falling 9.2 months behind during the pandemic. These will have everlasting effects on this generation. The future is counting on us. I come back to my time at Selma, where I met with a mother there who has 3 kids. She's a resident at the George Washington Carver Homes. Her life was changed because of a connectivity program initiated by Selma Mayor Dario Melton. This program brought free broadband and tablets to the community, and it allowed for this mother to complete online assignments for her degree and her children to finish their homework without those trips to the local library or restaurants. During my conversation with her, it was clear that the ability to get online at home is truly transformative, and it serves as a reminder that the federal government must make access to affordable, reliable broadband a top priority. And let me leave you with this. During Reverend Jesse Jackson's address before the Democratic National Convention in 1984, he said, quote, "No generation can choose the age or the circumstance in which it is born, but through leadership it can change to make the age in which it is born an age of enlightenment, an age of jobs and peace and justice." Close quote. It is important that we all adhere to those words of wisdom, because our fights for civil rights and justice and fairness, particularly in the tech and telecom ecosystems, will continue to impact nearly every aspect of our lives, not now, but also for generations to come. Thank you. Be safe and be well, everyone. Thank you.
We want to thank the Commissioner for his keynote remarks. And we also want to acknowledge our president and founder, who is actually in this discussion, Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr., who has been in the fight for digital equity and inclusion for all these years. We're going to begin our discussion, but before we begin our discussion, I want to let you all know, those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live, if you have any questions, those questions will be acknowledged at the end of our discussion. But we want you to put the question that you have in the comment section below our discussion screen. If you're joining us and you want to have that Twitter discussion, please hashtag RPC Telecom 2020 with your questions. Hashtag RPC Telecom 2020 with your questions. Dominique Harrison, our moderator, is a project director at the Aspen Institute in the Communications and Society program, where she helps promote integrated, thoughtful, values-based decision-making in the fields of communications, media, and information policy. She leads a new effort in the program, the Diversity and Technology Action Initiative, that seeks to develop equitable solutions for a more inclusive digital space to address barriers of inequality for communities of color. Dominique also manages the Conference on Communications Policy, the Roundtable on Spectrum Policy, and she oversees the Aspen Institute Communication and Society Guest Scholar Program, a scholarship initiative meant to give students of color the opportunity to foster their professional and academic career in the field of media and technology policy. Additionally, she has worked on the Dialogue on Public Libraries project. Prior to joining Aspen, Dominique worked as a communications fellow at the United Nations Development Program in the Washington, D.C. office, and as a monitoring and evaluation consultant at Internews, where she assisted in the development of a published report on women-focused media development. Through research, writing, and advocacy, Dominique seeks to create policies, programs, and initiatives that provide a more inclusive, equitable, tech-just society. She is especially interested in removing barriers to opportunities in education and employment, and developing solutions in the tech ecosystem that address inequality. Over to you, Dominique.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Dominique Harrison, and I am honored to be here. As Steve mentioned, we are here to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color and the role of technology in ensuring recovery and engagement of Black and Brown communities. I'm especially excited about this conversation because I get to speak with an esteemed panel I admire. So before we get started, I want to introduce you to, first, Francella Ochillo, Executive Director at Next Century Cities. She is a digital rights advocate and has worked on a variety of technology and telecommunications issues with a specific focus on assessing the impact of policy proposals on unserved and underserved communities. Next, we have Larry Irving, President and CEO of the Irving Group. Larry led the groundbreaking study that revealed the digital divide when he was a part of the Clinton administration, and he has established some of the earliest and most foundational U.S. domestic and international internet policies. Next, we have Christopher Lewis, President and CEO at Public Knowledge, an organization that promotes policies on behalf of the public on issues of freedom of expression and open internet and access to affordable community tools and creative works. Thank you all for being here. And of course, I must acknowledge Reverend Jesse Jackson, Sr., who is here to join us for the conversation.
Good morning.
Good morning, and good to see you. So thank you all for being here. As Steve mentioned, during this conversation, we'll have the opportunity to ask panelists any questions you might have. So please do so in the Q&A box below or in the comment section on Facebook. Okay, let's jump right in.
May I make a point here?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I want to thank Dr. Stark for a tremendous statement, giving us a frame to work with. Remember, Bush is in this space, we're going to stay in this space. Larry, thank you so much for your help down through the years. Thank you so much. I think there'll be a change in leadership at FCC. What does that mean? It's about choice. That's the FCC changing has to mean something, you know. When Brother Taylor was killed in Louisville, 80% of in Louisville is not connected. It's out of it. It's not just rural, it's too. I think that we are some top 6 desired question statement. Education didn't make the top 6. Education is the key to the pandemic. Who saw the pandemic except scientists who educated people? We had a chance to learn physics and develop become epidemiologists, so that the education and then of course next is communication. They work real hard to make sure everybody has access to telephone, right? Rural and urban. We're not working effectively so we get then this generation of technology to the same people. So I think it must be a higher priority. You know, there were many speeches that never mentioned FCC. So Larry said, I'd rather have 1,000 people at FCC than 10,000 and leave looking for a job. So the FCC will determine whether you get a job or not. You know, FCC is a big deal. I think we should spend some time on that because education about the FCC is a big deal. I want to thank all of you on the panel. I want to thank Steve Smith for doing a tremendous job. Keep us in this space. We must meet more often. Not just in a formal setting like this, but maybe with a broader group of people. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reverend, for those remarks. Really appreciate it. And those are some of the topics that we're going to talk about in our discussion. We know the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. is disproportionately impacting individuals and families who are Black, Latino, and Native American. Classes and many healthcare and other public services have gone online given health restrictions and safety. And access to the internet and computer technology has become an essential resource for everyone during this time. Yet the pandemic has highlighted the widening digital divide, the gap between those who have the ability to access the internet and technology and those who don't. Those most affected are poor and communities of color. According to a recent study by Boston Consulting Group, some 16 million children, or 30% of all U.S. public school students, lack either an internet connection or device at home adequate for distant learning. The Federal Communication estimates that 19 million Americans still lack broadband access, yet other sources place this number as high as 162 million. So what does all of this mean? Black and Brown Americans still do not have access to the technology and affordable high-speed broadband they need to succeed. And this, as Commissioner Stark mentioned, is a civil and human rights issue. So I want to turn it over to you, Francella. You work alongside communities to support local officials who are working to expand broadband access and increase adoption. What are some of the challenges you are hearing about in local communities?
Well, thank you so much first for inviting me, you guys. Reverend, it's really an honor just to even share time and space with you. And I'm really excited that this organization continues to keep this issue at the forefront. A lot of the times what I'm thinking about when people talk about the digital divide, it just seems like such an enormous definition of something. It's like so big, and it's because it's bigger than any one stakeholder can tackle. In a way, it keeps getting passed off to somebody else. It's either the provider's issue because they don't have enough infrastructure. It's that they don't have the devices in this community and we're not sure where that money's going to come from. There's all sorts of reasons why it's not your problem. And very often the people who have the resources to come up with solutions think that, well, I'm connected, so I'm okay. But the reality is there is a cost when we have millions of people across the country that cannot get connected. This is something that it reaches every single pocket of this country. It doesn't matter if you're in Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or in the continental US, it is your problem. And so we need to really start thinking about, because it's so enormous, how do we break off pieces to make sure everybody can take ownership of their part? Because this is an issue about access in part, because there are neighborhoods that have been targeted by redlining who don't have the requisite infrastructure, the ones that are suffering from hurricane, earthquake, and all kinds of natural disasters that need upgrades, the ones that are thinking about, no one ever came to our community. If you live in a tribal land, or even especially in the rural Southeast, think about those communities of color that are very much rural communities, which are often overlooked in these rural funding programs. And so we really need to think about, yeah, that's part of it, the infrastructure piece. So maybe if you're a provider or if you're just a community that says we need to raise the funds to build our own infrastructure, that's one part of it. And then another part of this is about us also saying, how do we start eliminating the obstacles to adoption? Because it's in part the affordability piece, which is something that we cannot run from, and we cannot literally capitulate to providers who don't want to share information. We need to really start asking questions about whether or not people can afford to not only get online, but to maintain their subscription so that they actually have seamless service. And then also on the adoption piece, how are we thinking about the digital tools? Do you have it? Do you have access to it? Did somebody loan it to you that you have to turn it in on June 1st? What does that mean? Because I'm really excited that Susie Q can go and, finish geometry. That's great. The problem is that Susie Q is out of school over the summer. Did anybody think through about how she's going to get an iPad to make sure she continued her learning? And so I think we need to really think aggressively about what's our plan. And then also when we're thinking about the digital literacy, this is not just making sure somebody can set up an email account because your bank told you that's the only way you can get an account. This is about making sure people can be competitive, because there is by design a reason why people of color are largely locked out of high-tech opportunities, because they don't have the same digital literacy. And that is not something that comes with, yes, I have access when I'm in school. That's about having a relationship with the technology, about being able to see it as something that that language is native to you. And so when we're talking about that, it's not enough to just say they got online and had the minimum benchmark of literacy, but what kind of partnerships did we create? What kind of environment did we create for them to have the support that they needed to meet those ongoing benchmarks of literacy? And then also when they needed help, do we have tech support in those neighborhoods that are the most under-resourced and essentially have no one to call? So I think when we think about this issue and when we're talking to local officials, a lot of them are in triage mode, where they are literally trying to stop bad things from happening. So they don't have the room to dream. They don't have the room to come up with great ideas. And I say that word intentionally when I say about dreaming, because I remember there was an organization that was coming up with a funding plan. And I said, we need to put imagination in there, because the problem is imagination and dreaming gets to be set aside for the people who are connected with resources. They get to come up with all kinds of cool ideas and find resources for them, and everybody else just gets by. And we need everybody's ideas. We need to create platforms that welcome those without them being a threat to the people who are in those fields. So I think it's really important that we also think getting out of this reactionary posture and getting into a place where we're thinking about all of the things that high-speed connectivity enables, and opening up our tribe on who gets to submit good ideas.
Thank you, Francella. That highlighted a lot of issues that we see communities of color facing right now. Larry, I was wondering if you could talk to us about some of the systemic inequalities that communities of color are facing, given the lack of access to broadband.
Well, first, thank you. And Reverend Jackson, it's great to see you. I was talking to the panel before we started, and we go back 38 years with Brother Mickey Leland, where we first met when we were talking about just getting people access to the telephone. And it's interesting because the systemic problems have been the same for almost all that time. If you go back to the 1980s, we may talk about Lifeline, but the Lifeline program came about in the mid 1980s because of the advocacy of Reverend Jackson, because of the work of Congressman Leland. And even back in the 1980s, what most people don't recall is that if you were Black or brown, you were 20% less likely to have a home telephone than if you were a white American. White Americans were 90+% telephone penetration. For Black America, it was in 75 to 85%. For Latino America, the same. And if you were poor and Black, it was as low as 50% in some communities. My hometown of Brooklyn, New York, we were looking at 60, 70% home telephone penetration. And that came from a lot of things, underinvestment. We've heard about redlining. Frantella talked about it, and Commissioner Starks talked about it. When you look at our public housing, which disproportionately have people of color there, we don't have the broadband access that we need and deserve in public housing. When you look at programs like the E-rate, it's a tragedy in America that on one hand, the E-rate exists, and that is great. But it is a tragedy when small children have to leave their homes and sit outside their school, as a young Latino boy had to do in Tucson, in order to do his homework. And then if we talk about our elderly, 27% of people over 65 don't have broadband connectivity. And as the commissioner alluded to, it gets worse if you're poor and elderly. And then if you're talking about rural America, over the last 4 years, one of the great tragedies has been that some have politicized the concept of the digital divide. Instead of talking about connecting all Americans, whether you're Black or brown, Latin American, whether you live in Southeast America or Southwest America, some have said the digital divide is purely a rural program. So we're going to spend $20 billion based upon this administration's efforts to bridge the rural divide. But it has been discussed as 3 to 4 times more people in urban America who don't have access to broadband. So when we're talking about education right now, if you go to Queens, New York, go to PS 118, the school I graduated from, that got me through my life, 43% of the kids in that school don't have broadband access or don't have a device. But what's worse is the majority of the kids in that school were already a grade behind. So now from March till this year, many of those schools have had functionally no education. How do you make up at 11 or 12 or 13 a year of missed education at 8, 9, or 10? And finally, and I'll begin to conclude on this, and I'm going to take Queens again because it's where I grew up. And Brooklyn and Queens are places I know. In the block in which I grew up, if you stuck a pin and went 10 blocks around it, because of these people who are firemen, they're the people who give you a token at the subway station, because they're police officers, because they run small businesses. They were the first to be infected by the COVID virus. On the 10 blocks around where I lived, there was a death on every block. Those folks don't have the technology. Most of them have to go to work every day. And they don't even have the ability to do telemedicine with their doctors if they get sick. That's tragic. What's particularly tragic is what's happened is a failure of both vision and execution. We've known for 30 years, almost 25 years, as the first digital divide report. We started working on the internet before that. We've known for the 25 years of the digital divide era that we needed to connect every American. When the Clinton administration ended and the Bush administration started, you could not utter the words digital divide inside the White House or inside the then FCC. We're now kind of coming back to it, but imagine we lost 8 years of connecting millions of Americans. Imagine we those 8 years back and we'd accelerated connectivity because we knew it had to happen. And then when people began to realize it was a problem, we focused on just a quarter of the problem rather than looking holistically. If we connected our schools, we connected our public housing, if we brought Lifeline to modernize program, we could do what needs to be done. Instead, we've lost that time. And what I really worry about are those 8, 9-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 10-year-olds who are losing a year of their education. And we just today, New York City public schools closed again. What are those kids going to do? How do we make it up to them?
Thank you, Larry, for that. And speaking of solutions and what we should be advocating for, Chris, I'd love to hear what kinds of policies your organization is advocating for to remedy these issues.
Great. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Reverend Jackson, again, for inviting me to participate in this event this year with my friends Francella and Larry. Let me pick up on solutions where Larry left off, because Larry talked about a lack of vision and a lack of execution. You know, I was going to say we failed over the last 10 to 12 years, certainly because we haven't had the will to execute on the vision that folks like Larry, who have been working on this for several decades, to implement the solutions that have been put forward, or to modify the solutions that have been put forward to make them work for the broadband age. And it's unfortunate, the second project I ever worked on a decade ago at the FCC was the National Broadband Plan. It had solutions a decade ago and predicted in the plan that if we did not get ahead of the digital divide, if we did not connect all Americans to broadband, that a pandemic, it used the word pandemic, could come along and that folks would be disproportionately impacted. And we're seeing that now with all the statistics that Commissioner Starks put forward. So when it comes to solutions, I think we need to find greater will in our political leaders to see that whether you live in a rural community or whether you live in an urban community, as Larry was describing, you have constituents that have the same need, that are either low income or being left out with access, or don't have the digital literacy skills, the kind of triumvirate of barriers that Francella talked about. We need an agency that is empowered to actually attack all of those vectors that create the digital divide. So it's not just throwing money at the problem. We've had programs like E-Rate and others that have thrown money at the problem but haven't done it in a holistic way. We haven't invested those dollars in a smart way. We need to make sure that we have maps that accurately show who is and who is not connected. We need to make sure that in addition to dollars, that we have regulations that prohibit some of the practices that have led to some neighborhoods being served and other neighborhoods not being served, the digital redlining that's been brought up already. We need to have a revamp of our subsidy programs so that they can actually subsidize directly to broadband. Right now, the FCC in 2017 pulled itself out from having authority over broadband, which puts it on legally precarious ground if it tried to enact anything to shift its subsidies towards broadband-only services. While at the same time, the industry is moving to consolidate all services, voice, data, video, all of it onto a broadband feed. That's a good thing, by the way. We want that transition to happen, but it needs to happen in a way where people are not left behind. And so we have to have an agency with authority over broadband to protect consumers and make sure that when that transition is made, that there are standards for quality, which need to be raised right now. That there are rules for when reliability of the network is not as strong as it should be, especially in natural disaster situations like we've seen in California with the wildfires, or floods in the Midwest, or hurricanes in the Southeast, or hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We have folks who have lost connectivity, and that means lost connectivity to emergency communications, lost connectivity to their businesses. This is life and death for people. So it's not just throwing money at the problem. We're going to see in the new administration, hopefully, a push for an infrastructure bill. That's important for broadband and connectivity. But if that's not paired with oversight and authority at the FCC to deal with these other issues, then we're going to continue to see a digital divide.
Thank you, Chris. Francella, and speaking of solutions and in that lane, I'd love to just hear some of the unique kind of initiatives that you've seen or heard about that have been developed in local communities to address these issues.
Well, I think that some of the most successful models really it's when people actually understand what their community needs. So the thing is, you might be in a tribal community that you're thinking spectrum is for us, let's go ahead and set up some sort of wireless solution. We're going to essentially teach people how to build, take advantage of this public resource, and all of those stars align where you're like, okay, this is great. We're going to set up a network where providers don't want to go. If you are in somewhere like, for example, Detroit or Chicago, where you're saying we have a lot of philanthropic support, so we're going to lock arms with not only our providers and ask them to do more, but we're also going to tap some of our philanthropic donors to bring awareness to the issue, and then also get political support from the people that are in power. If you are in places that are some of the smaller communities where you're essentially saying, no one even sees us, very often they have to tap into either university networks or essentially start coming up with alternative solutions because those private partnerships are just not working. But then you have some that are essentially forced into building their own networks, like places like in Lafayette, Louisiana, where essentially they actually started by asking the providers to do more. And when the providers were like, oh, we're good, we're in a good place, they decided we're going to do our own feasibility studies and find a way to do it for ourselves. And I think that when you're thinking about what's the best solution for your community, you have to start with the place that there are not going to be any models that work exactly the same in any two communities. So when we think about the fact that we have over 10,000 municipalities to essentially accommodate, and essentially 1/3 of them are still looking for some sort of solutions, we need to be flexible in terms of what are we asking for in these solutions? What does that brain trust look like when we get together and start coming up with ideas? But at the core of all of this, one thing I want to make sure, I always have to hammer this home, if we keep talking about the digital divide, we cannot separate this from poverty. Because poverty, where this is intersecting with housing insecurity, food insecurity, when you have that scarcity, especially in the United States, where, speaking as a first-generation American, where everyone experiences things in surplus. Like, you have so much food, you need a closet for it. Like, that's amazing. So in a place where you have all of these things in surplus, and there's this one thing that everybody needs to be able to communicate that they can't get to. And so when we think about that dynamic, I think a lot of the times people are just trying to get by and make do with what they have. And what we need to start doing is teaching people how to fish for themselves. That means that we need to partner with community colleges, vocational schools, and other academic institutions to teach people how to build their own networks when providers don't want to go there. That means that we need to actually rethink the power dynamics when we are essentially giving licensing and franchise agreements to providers to operate in a certain territory, and then they only deploy in the city center. Because then what you have is all of these perimeters that bump up against each other. Lexington, Kentucky, great example, where you essentially have this very well-to-do connected center, and if you go all the way around that perimeter of that area, it's just disconnected, you're lost. And so when we're thinking about this cascade of issues, that it's not always just about the deployment, and then it's an issue of poverty, and then it's an issue of once they get the network, do they actually have the tools to connect? There's all of these things. We need to form an assembly line, and not whenever, but now. And so to kind of think about, where are you in the assembly line? What's your piece that you're going to carry? Because in a way, the enormity of it is what's scaring people off, because we keep talking about it as this lofty issue. And then when it comes to doing solutions, there's a very small group of people that are invited into the room. And I offer that we really need to think about, what are you doing for the room in your community? Because we cannot have all of those centralized ideas happening in DC. They need to happen in places like Jamaica, Queens, or, Larry brought up that example, or places where you have all of these multi-housing units that essentially are not part of the way that the money and the funding is being deployed in New York City, or Lost Hills, California, or some of the poorest cities in the nation in Michigan. Four-state Louisiana, that's where I'm from. Poverty is it's rampant. And the thing is, they don't have the resources to come up with tangible funding solutions, but they do have human capital and they do have good ideas. And it's up to us to give them platforms to not only socialize them, but to actually deputize them with power so that people invest in them.
Thank you, Francella. I'd love to hit it back to Larry to talk some more about what the FCC should be doing and the policies that need to be developed to support Black and Brown communities, given what's going on with broadband connectivity.
I can't control that.
There's a couple. Thank you. There's a couple of things that could be done and should be done, and thank you for that passion, Fran, because I love it. And whenever I hear you, it reminds me of when I had your youth. Because the good news is that 25 years ago, when the internet was new, we were smart about one thing. We were smart about knowing that what we didn't know and bringing communities together to solve their own problems. The lessons learned, the best practices that were going on were collated, were communicated, and everybody got a chance to learn from everybody else. The FCC and the Department of Commerce need to get back to speaking to the people in the communities, because most solutions to most problems are found at the level closest to the problem. I watch who is making policy, and most of them have never missed a meal. Most of them have never had a child who didn't have access to the tools that they need. Most of them have never known a grandparent who's aged, who's infirm, who can't go out because of COVID, but doesn't have broadband at home. But the people who deal with those folks every day will have some solutions. So that would be the first thing I'd start with. Let's open up the communications so we're really listening to everybody. But there's something else that's happening. Chris will understand this, I think, because we were both a part of the transition. There's going to be a very narrow window to get some of the things we want done. The first 100, maybe 180 days of the next Biden-Harris administration with the new FCC are going to be critical to getting things done. Because once you get past that halfway point, you're into the cycle for the next congressional elections, and then you start getting into the next presidential elections. You have a tight window. I was part of 2 transitions. I've watched this happen before. If you don't get it front-end loaded and get the funding early, you never get it loaded. So the 3 things I would say they have to do. They've got to reform and refund Lifeline. Lifeline right now means that you get $9.25 that per household, and you can spend that $9.25 per month for either a cell phone or a landline or whatever $9.25 will buy you in broadband. And anybody who's got broadband knows that $9.25 don't buy you much broadband. But if you want to keep grandma connected to broadband at home, that means mom doesn't have a cell phone. If you want to give mom the cell phone, that means dad doesn't have a landline so his employer can call him in the house. You get one. That's it. That's the limit. We've got to change that. The second thing we've got to do, we've got to really focus on connecting our schools and our libraries through the E-rate, hospitals, community clinics, but we need to do something else. Every school in this country, thanks to the Clinton administration, is connected to broadband. And thanks to the Obama administration, it's internet, and Obama got them broadband. But you can only use that broadband inside the school. I want to see a plan where you take the broadband connection to every school, to every hospital, every community college, every historically Black college and university, and throw an antenna on top of those institutions and use that antenna to provide wireless access to low-income people in those communities. We can, it is very early, it is still experimental, but if we had the will and the wallet, we could make that happen meaningfully. And the third thing I want to make sure we have happen is we've got to get instrumentalities to children. I was one of those people who early in the internet revolution said that this device could be a learning device. I was somewhat wrong. It can be a learning device. It cannot be the principal learning device for too many children. We've got to use tablets. We can use Chromebooks or Airbooks, MacBook Airs. We have to find a functionality that gives a kid all of the capacity. And you also have to understand that a kid who's K through 6 needs a different instrumentality than a kid who's 6 through 12 in terms of schools. And we also think about our college students. Last year, this time, December 6th, I went up to New York City and I gave a speech at the City University of New York. 250,000 students on degree granting programs, 250,000 folks who are just taking courses because they want to be smarter. Too many of those kids didn't have broadband at home. I saw kids sitting in Cooney at midnight because they didn't have the broadband or a quiet place at home to study. But I also saw, and this broke my heart, I saw more than one young woman and man who were doing their term papers on a cell phone. And anybody who's been to college knows that is an impossible thought, but we have thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of students across this country who don't have the instrumentality to get their college educations because we haven't made the investments. If I was going to say there's some things we need to do, those are the places I would start. And we need to start now because July, August, September of next year, we're back into another election cycle. It's a lot harder to get these things done.
Larry.
Yes, sir.
Too few people know you and Chris and the franchise even exists. The cable was supposed to give us more access to some other than more than Joe's opinion of stuff. We got to fight with you on a broader platform. A. B, we're going to have a meeting to follow up this meeting today, yesterday, and tomorrow. We must turn this into a mass movement. I know a church in America that's talking about broadband on Sunday morning. Yeah, they got to. When Jimmy Harris was running for senator in South Carolina, between Orangeburg and between Columbia and Charleston, most people are not connected to any of the damn thing. It's disconnected altogether. And we've not made it the issue it must become. So I'm anxious for us to have a follow-up meeting. We literally have to form us an organization, this bigger than our individual organization, kind of collective thrust. This becomes a church issue. It becomes a disc jockey. Disc jockeys got to get into this, you know what I mean? Talking about people, disc jockeys and ministers and these Trinity Council people. Because I tell you, the information is too much information, too few people. And chances are, well, you must determine that. You and Franchella, Chris, you guys got to determine what the ask is. We don't know what to ask for. Well, what budget should we be demanding to make sense of this thing? If it doesn't come use, it will not come at all. We need you to put together the ask. This Congress is like to listen. Bodies like to listen. They're not going to create the ask. They'll respond to the ask. Please.
I'm available. When you need me, I'm there, sir.
Yeah.
In that same spirit, I was wondering if we could collaborate to do somewhat of a digital manifesto, if you will, between the organizations.
I definitely think we could do that. And I would add, some of the trusted sources of information out there in our communities, Black newspapers, local newspapers,
Yes.
they're struggling right now because of the change in the advertising market, because advertising now is being dominated by Google and Facebook online. We need to work with them because they are trusted in our communities. We need to support them. And we need to push this movement that the Reverend talked about us building out through them as sources, because they're going to be trusted and they're going to be a part of being able to help folks understand what they need to do to get connected.
Chris, we need to negotiate with them too. And back on the era when GM was the deal, we negotiated with GM to get access to the marketplace, to the boardroom, to suppliers, dealers. And so Facebook and Google, that's what they are today. And we can't just go to them individually without a little plan. We must take it. There must be a mass action, mass negotiation with them, because they have the capacity. Louisville, down in what Breonna Taylor was here, 80% of Louisville is not connected at all, except telephone and television. They're disconnected. And it's not an issue. With a given church on Sunday morning, they'll bring up what you discussed. I'm trying to figure out, as you talk, how do I get this to the maximum number of people? I mean, what you're doing, you guys must become popular. It's not that you're sick necessarily. You have to become, listen to Franchella talk. We need to hear a lot on television and radio and newspapers. You are our best kept secrets. We need you in a big way right there.
I'm ready to enlist, yeah.
And I wanted to add something. I'm just really excited just even hearing some of the ideas on this panel. And I totally agree with the Reverend on the part about being explicit about like having a really salient ask, something that's easy for people to walk with. This is my ask. This is why it means what it means to me. And also empowering people to tell their own stories, because on the local level, that's one of the most important things that's not breaking through to Washington, D.C., because very often federal policy is crafted with only essentially national players or high-level connected people with the FCC. But when we're really thinking about specifically, I wanted to just make sure, Larry made a comment about how we're thinking about how this connects to education. One thing I want to point out is that people are living longer. The idea that our education is only about K through 12 or college, we need to really be thinking about the fact that most people, I mean, I don't even know somebody in my law school class that only plans on having one career. Because essentially maybe they're going to practice and then they'll become an adjunct, there's a little something consulting on the side. But essentially we're starting to get to a place where people have to be prepared for more than one career. So at some point, after your original and your post-secondary learning, you're going to have to go back to retrain or upskill. And what are your opportunities? So essentially, when we create these programs that essentially only apply to students who are maybe, let's just say, under 25, just a catch-all, we really need to think about what happens when people are at that 40 and 50-year-old band and they're thinking about what's next. Or for the people who are 60 who were phased out of their jobs, who have to go back to work because they don't have a choice. Because we are no longer living in a society where people only have one career path. So we really need to think about how this enables not only the digital skills that you need along the journey, but how it actually allows you to participate in the up training and the upskilling that you'll actually need into your last chapter.
Can I add a coda to that? If you look at America, 60% of American adults don't have a college education, do not have 4 years of college. 70+% of Black America and Latino America don't have college plus. So we've got, and we're in an information, we've moved from an industrial society to an information society. You constantly have to retrain yourself and reskill yourself. My dad worked for Con Edison for 40 years of his life. He, had a nice working class lifestyle, middle class lifestyle, aspirational, that, helped me and my family. None of us know anybody who works 40 years for one company anymore. It doesn't happen that way anymore. And in the old Con Ed days, it constantly helped him get the skills he needed. But if you're not, now in a gig economy world where you're kind of a disposable worker, making sure that these folks are continually trained and retrained and have the ability to learn the things they need to survive in this economy are more than important. It's crucial. And then when you think about the number of people in this society, we have the division in this society, folks who are not discerning consumers of information. So they're on the internet, but we have people who believe that the earth is flat and that, there are cannibals, killing babies in pizzerias, because digital literacy is more than learning how to get a job. It's about how to understand information that comes across a platform that's addictive, that's exploitive, and that purposely misinforms. And if we don't fix that, if we continue letting this technology drive us further apart instead of finding ways to bring it back together, we're going to be in a very sad state. And that's,
Larry,
yes, sir.
I ask you, do we have the equivalent to Lifeline on broadband?
Sorry?
The equivalent to Lifeline.
Lifeline is extended to broadband, but it's a very small amount of money. We are trying to get that dollar number increased from under $10 to something in excess of $25. Some have set up to 40 or 50. There's a lot of discussion in there. Chris is even up to 50, I think, is Chris. So we're at $10 now, and somewhere between 25 and 50 is where we'll likely land.
And what I'm trying to say is that, the waste management guy is disconnected. The garbage man is connected. Everybody's connected. The Uber driver, the cab driver. And somehow there are large segments of our population, our American population, was Appalachia, Alabama for that matter, not connected, and don't even aspire to be connected. They don't know what being disconnected really means. And so my one friend guitar is, we must be ourselves as we did Larry many years before. Maybe 25 people or less that on the phone, Franchella and Chris and all that, and have us to meet and put a plan for action, not just to ask, but plan for action. How do we make sure that we cannot be ignored, that the Washington Post, New York Times cannot ignore us. AP and Reuters must not be able to ignore you. The big crisis now, big military budget, military can do a damn thing with trying to not catch COVID-19. Our journalists are scientists. Our journalists, you're the journalists in this. You're the lead source in this. And how we wrestle with how we can make this a mass movement.
I think the three of us will enlist. Let us know how we can be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah. Dominique, I was going to make a point about COVID because, the stats that we heard about how Black communities, brown communities disproportionately impacted, certainly the types of jobs that many of us have in our communities was a part of it. But what really angered me was early on, especially in the pandemic, was the amount of disinformation that Larry was mentioning that was going out around the disease, or around the virus, in our communities on social media. This is serious. It's life or death, and it exacerbates the disproportionate impact of the virus in our communities. So it is really important that we think about this, about how technology and the internet impacts us systemically, and that we have the conversations, as the Reverend's talking about, in our community, about our community, in a way that people trust it and can receive it.
But I'm making a case, the cement is still wet around the Biden administration. Cement is still wet. If we went to him now, during this awful period here, we need $50 per, as opposed to $9.25, Larry. We need to have, as everybody asks, we need to, if he asks, what do y'all want? We can't say freedom now. We got to answer that in rather specific form and show the disadvantage of not having it, the advantage of having it. So I need somebody to put together a short paper on if we met with Biden, what we ask him today.
Yeah.
I suspect
you.
Chris has most of that paper already written, and that Francella has the other half of it written. I think they could probably have a 15-minute conversation after this call and get most of that done. Just a guess, but I think they're pretty close to that.
$50 subsidy. We've been pushing for it. There was no COVID package that moved this fall, but that's what we wanted on it. And I know Larry's got ideas about how to restructure the program for the long haul. I mean, this is what we need, and we need to make those asks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing those topics up about digital literacy, about jobs, supporting especially women of color who are impacted by the loss of jobs because they are in the service industry, disinformation and misinformation around COVID, and that will soon be about vaccine, right? That is a concern that we will see on the horizon as more information comes out about that. But getting back to what Reverend Jackson bring up, President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have made a priority to promote universal broadband. This is a part of their economic recovery plan. And so given those digital landscape and all the kind of challenges and issues that we've spoken about today, what other actions must the new administration take on to ensure the recovery and engagement of Black and Brown communities? And this question I open up to all of you.
If I could offer really quickly, one thing I think is that grant funding needs to be offered to local level municipalities, community groups. They should not have to compete with funders with providers for funding. They should be able to actually submit great ideas for the way that they're connecting people, because especially in light of COVID, some of them don't have philanthropic partners. They've essentially had to come up with makeshift solutions just to fit the people in their neighborhood. And if we can find a way to fund those ideas and even scale them and show other municipalities how to replicate those models, that's something that's going to at least stir up some new ideas, because we can't solve this problem with the old frameworks that worked for telephone. We need to think about how do we think of funding models that are designed for broadband specifically.
A couple of things, and first you got to do is the mapping. I know the commissioner talked about it, but that's essential. You don't want to spend money inefficiently. There will not be endless amount of money. We don't know who's not connected. We don't have good information. That has to be the first priority. A second priority has to be connect all of our public institutions, our schools, our hospitals, our libraries, community centers, HBCUs, community colleges. That has to happen. We also need to look at one issue. Too many we heard 441,000 black small businesses, and probably an equal number of brown, Latino small businesses went out of business during this pandemic. Part of the problem with those businesses, they weren't connected to the internet. And so when, if you own a restaurant and you can take orders online, then you can keep some money coming in. If you're not online, when your business closes physically, you close your business completely. We have to relook at where in New York City, 40% of small businesses don't have access to a gig network, whereas almost every business over $1 million in revenue has access to a gig network. We need to look at that and why, and we need to fix that. There has been some redlining going on. We need to fix that. And one other thing, the next generation we're going to talk about is 5G. This current FCC has made it possible for wireless companies, if they choose to redline 5G or to slow roll deployment of 5G in low-income communities and communities of color. We need to fix that as well. Those are some tangible, fungible things that should happen right now. You should not be deprived of internet connection because you're poor, because you're low income, because you're Black, because you're brown. Unfortunately, the companies now get to make those decisions as opposed to policymakers in local levels, and that's something we need to and can fix.
Larry.
Yes, sir.
In our situation in Chicago, 10 years of the largest employer may have been the post office, a speaker, or they make Ford Motor Company. The largest employer in Chicago are Black people. Black behind more than anybody else. Churches, ministers, musicians, 3 or 4 people, some churches, 100 people, all of it. But the small business in our community is the second largest employer in town. And they also have more second chance people than anybody else. So that this is must be high on our conscious agenda. So I keep leaning on you, Larry, since you're the godfather of this. Pull together the family. Let's talk offline there, figure out how we can get something to get to Joe Biden real fast.
Happy to help, sir. As I told somebody the other day, when I left government in 1999, you were the first person to hire me. You were my first client. So, once a client, you always come back to your first. And so I haven't forgotten 1999 and it's 2020, but we can do what we need to do.
Thank you, Steve.
Chris, love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I was going to add just two thoughts to what Larry was saying, because the Biden-Harris administration or Biden-Harris team, has laid out the priority that you mentioned about funding broadband deployment and getting it to everyone. Two important conditions that should be on that money, because the ISPs have said they want that money. So let's make sure it's done smartly, and the mapping is part of the two conditions. Number one, let's raise the standard for the quality of broadband that we're asking them to give. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, inside the Beltway, urban area, high poverty school system. I know families of 4 whose kids are doing distance learning remotely, and their father, the mother's doing additional trainings, and the father's working remotely at home. They don't have the bandwidth in the house to cover that. And they have a pretty high speed line. We got to raise the standard. 25.3 is the current standard. 25.3 is not going to be enough. And so whatever we deploy needs to be a higher standard. And the second thing is we need to have some sort of rule about serving everyone. And this will touch both rural and urban areas. You see it most common in rural areas, or at least talked about the most in rural areas. About how the population centers serve, but folks on the outskirts aren't. If you're serving a community, you need to serve everyone in that community, and I think that needs to be a string on the money if it's handed out, and that can help us with the digital redlining issue in urban areas that has been proven in studies in Cleveland, Houston, urban areas where one neighborhood is served and the other one is not. If you're serving community, serve everybody. If you're going to get federal dollars, you have to serve everybody.
We asked someone about the right to vote. What's needed is a constitutional right to vote, and stop vote suppression and count, blah, blah. We're going to ask right now, the reason I keep coming back to you, Larry, and you, Franchella, and the like, is we can answer right now what do you want question into the resolution. I mean, we won't do what, Chris, we want what you just said we need. But those of you who are on the front line of this have not been able to. For example, when the pandemic, we put together the National Medical Association, National Bar Association, we did a medical manifesto. Because we know that we were being hit by this thing, and people riding buses can't social distance. Many people travel with 3 buses, bus to L, bus from the L to where white people live. And they can't, and that's where they're dying and come back to crowded housing. But we have a medical manifesto. We need to get a manifesto from you rather quickly, because I think that we have a sense of who's going on the FCC, who's going to be chairing all that. It won't mean anything. We're in charge and don't have our stuff together in that extent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I think you guys have definitely made it apparent that the digital divide is connected to every part of everyone's life: education, health, wealth, jobs, and it's something that we need to start advocating for in federal government, and to make sure that our president-elect, the transition team, is working on these issues and how it connects to Black and Brown communities. This conversation deserves so much more discussion, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and our time together is coming to an end. And I want to say thank you to our panelists, Chris, Francella, and Larry, and Reverend Jackson, to the Rainbow Coalition for giving me the opportunity to moderate. And before I turn it back over to Steve, please watch some remarks from one of this year's donors.
Having the internet has allowed me to explore my passions and create new ones. Over the last few months, I've been working on a children's book. It's all about a kid with big dreams who wants to succeed at all kinds of things. Sometimes he doubts himself. He wonders if he should be more realistic. But he works hard, he keeps dreaming big, and he goes on to achieve amazing things. It's meant to be a lesson for kids, but it's also a reminder for me to show the world what I can do.
Dominique.
Thank you.
Dominique. We want to stress
Yes.
our thanks to Dominique in a special way. I want you guys to do something. www.rainbow.org. I want you guys to join Rainbow Push. We must have an organized approach to this thing. And we're in the mass mobilization business. www.rainbowpush.org. Click membership. We're going to build out the relationship between us and the government and us and Silicon Valley. We can do that, okay? Please join today.
Absolutely. I'm here to join.
Thank you, Dominique, and thank you to all of our distinguished panelists who came and gave us that great discussion on the implications of COVID in this digital age. We want to invite you back or reconvene this discussion at a later date where we can possibly put this or broadcast this on our Saturday morning forum. So we'll definitely be back in touch with you all to see when we can reconvene this discussion with the same panelists to broadcast you on our Saturday morning forum and again on this social media broadcast. Again, we want to invite all of our viewers back on tomorrow at 12 o'clock where we'll discuss what technology policies can benefit communities of color. And we have a great list of panelists that will come back tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We want to invite everyone back to join us. We want to thank all of our sponsors, Verizon, Charter, Comcast, T-Mobile, and the Motion Picture Association of America, who sponsored our event. Again, thank you to all, and we hope that you can join us again tomorrow.
Steve?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Saturday morning, we're live on Impact Network, Impact and on the Road Network. So we get lots of churches, lots of people in places where other people don't reach. So you've been live on that forum. It's not just local, it's a very international forum. All right, thank you, Steve.
Yes, sir.